The glass shattered before anyone understood why. Vittorio Moretti stood frozen in the doorway of his study, his hand still raised where it had knocked the crystal tumbler from the side table. His breath came fast. His eyes were fixed on the woman kneeling by the window, a soft cloth in her hand, wiping down the old wooden shelf as she had done every evening for 6 years. Elena Marchetti had not seen him come in. She had been humming, quietly, the way she always did when she thought she was alone. A small, gentle tune, nothing more than a habit, something she barely noticed herself doing anymore. But Vittorio noticed. Vittorio noticed everything, and this was a sound he had not heard in over 40 years. "Stop," he said, his voice low and rough. "Stop right there." Elena turned, startled, the cloth still in her hand. She saw the look on his face, and her whole body went still. In 6 years working in this house, she had never once seen Don Vittorio Moretti look afraid. "Sir," she said carefully, "did I break something? I can clean it up right away." He did not answer. He stepped closer, slowly, as if approaching something that might vanish if he moved too fast. His eyes searched her face, looking for something he could not name. "That song," he said, "the one you were humming. Sing it again." Elena blinked. "It is nothing, sir. Just an old tune. My grandmother used to sing it to me when I was small. I did not mean to disturb you." "Sing it," he said again, and this time, there was something close to pleading in his voice, though a man like Vittorio Moretti was not supposed to plead for anything. Elena's heart began to race. She had worked long enough in dangerous houses to know that when a powerful man's voice changed like this, the safest thing to do was obey immediately and ask no questions. She hummed the first few notes, then let the words come out quietly, in a language that was not quite Italian, and not quite anything else, a mixture passed down through generations of women in her family. Vittorio's face went pale. He reached out and gripped the back of a chair, as if the floor beneath him had tilted. "Where," he whispered, "did you learn that song?" "From my grandmother," Elena said again, her voice trembling now, though she still did not understand why this mattered so much. "She taught it to me before she passed." "Why, sir? Is something wrong?" Vittorio did not answer right away. He lowered himself slowly into the chair, his hand still shaking slightly, and for a long moment, he simply stared at the woman who had cleaned his house for 6 years, without either of them ever exchanging more than a few polite words. "My mother used to sing that song," he finally said. "She sang it to me every night before I went to sleep, when I was a boy in Sicily. After she died, I never heard it again. I thought it had died with her. I thought I was the only person left in the world who remembered it." Elena's hands went still. She had never once considered that a lullaby passed through her family might mean anything to anyone outside of it. It was simply a piece of home, something warm from her childhood, nothing she thought to question. "That cannot be," she said softly. "It is only a song my grandmother knew. She was from a small village. She never spoke about anyone important. She was just a housekeeper too, sir, much like me." The moment those words left her mouth, something shifted in Vittorio's expression. His eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with the sharp focus of a man who has spent his whole life learning to notice details other people miss. "A housekeeper," he repeated. "Where did she work?" Elena hesitated. She had told very few people about her grandmother's history, mostly because there was so little of it to tell. Her grandmother had rarely spoken of her early life, and what she did share came in scattered fragments, offered only late at night when she thought no one was listening closely. "She worked for a family in Sicily," Elena said. "A wealthy family, I believe, though she never gave many details. She left that life a long time before I was born and came to build a quiet life of her own. She did not like to talk about those years. I always assumed there was sadness in it that she wanted to leave behind." Vittorio's jaw tightened. He stood up again, pacing now, his footsteps slow and deliberate against the marble floor. "What was her name?" he asked. "Your grandmother." "What was she called?" "Isabella," Elena answered. "Isabella Conti, though I believe that was not the name she was born with. She changed it, I think, when she moved away. She never explained why." The room fell into a heavy silence. Vittorio stood by the window now, looking out at the dark gardens beyond the glass, his back to Elena, his shoulders tense. My mother's name was Carlotta, he said finally, his voice quieter now, almost gentle. She had a sister once. A sister no one in my family was ever allowed to speak of. I only learned of her existence by accident, many years ago, from an old photograph I found hidden in my grandfather's desk. My mother refused to explain who the woman in the photograph was. She said only that her sister had disappeared long before I was born, and that speaking her name brought nothing but grief into the house. Elena felt a strange chill move through her, though she could not explain why. I am sorry, sir. That must have been very painful for your family. It was more than painful, Vittorio said. It was a wound that never healed, because no one ever understood exactly why it happened. My mother carried that sorrow with her until the day she died, and she never told me the full truth. All I know is that something happened between the two sisters, something so serious that one of them vanished from our lives entirely, and the family agreed never to search for her again. He turned back to face Elena, and there was something new in his eyes now, something careful and searching. Tell me more about your grandmother, he said. Everything you remember, even the smallest details. Elena set down her cloth and folded her hands in her lap, trying to steady her nerves. She had never expected a conversation like this, not with a man like Vittorio Moretti, not about her own quiet, ordinary grandmother. She was a gentle woman, Elena began, very private. She worked hard her whole life, first as a young woman in service to a family she rarely mentioned, and later on her own, raising my mother alone after my grandfather passed away early. She loved to garden, she loved to sing, and she always seemed to be waiting for something, though I never understood what. Waiting for what? Vittorio asked. I do not know, Elena admitted. Sometimes she would sit by the window in the evenings and look out at the road, as if she expected someone to come walking up it. When I asked her who she was waiting for, she would only smile sadly and say it did not matter anymore. I assumed she meant my grandfather, since she missed him terribly after he died. But now, hearing you speak of your mother and her sister, I wonder if there was something else. Vittorio's hands tightened at his sides. Did she ever mention a place called Villa Rosa? Or a family by the name of Bellini? Elena's breath caught. She had heard those words before, long ago, spoken quietly by her grandmother, in a moment Elena had almost forgotten until this very second. Villa Rosa, she repeated slowly. Yes. I remember now. She mentioned it once, when I was very young. I asked her about her life before she came to our town, and she said only that she once lived near a beautiful house called Villa Rosa, and that she had left it behind, because staying would have broken her heart even further. I did not think much of it at the time. Children rarely understand the weight behind such words. Vittorio closed his eyes for a moment, as if trying to steady himself against a memory too large to hold. Villa Rosa was my grandfather's estate, he said quietly. The very house where my mother and her sister grew up together. If your grandmother knew that name, then she was not simply a housekeeper who once worked nearby. She was connected to my family in a way I never imagined possible. Elena's heart pounded. Part of her wanted to dismiss the idea entirely, to insist that this was nothing more than a strange coincidence. Two old women from the same region who happened to share fragments of the same history. But another part of her, the part that had spent years quietly wondering about the gaps and silences in her grandmother's story, felt a slow and unsettling recognition begin to take shape. Sir, she said carefully, even if this is true, I do not understand what it means. My grandmother has been gone for many years. She left no letters, no photographs from that time, nothing that could tell either of us the full truth. Perhaps not, Vittorio said. But there are other ways to find truth. Records, old contacts, people who remember things that families like mine try very hard to forget. I did not survive as long as I have in this life, by accepting silence when something does not add up. And nothing about this adds up simply, Elena. Nothing at all. He said her name for the first time that evening, and something about the way he said it made Elena realize that whatever quiet, invisible life she had built for herself in this house was about to change completely. What will you do? She asked. I will find out who your grandmother truly was, Vittorio said, and in doing so, I may finally learn what really happened to my mother's sister all those years ago. I have waited my whole life for answers that no one in my family was willing to give me. I do not intend to let this chance slip away, simply because the truth might be difficult to hear." Elena looked down at her hands, trying to process everything that had happened in the space of only a few minutes. An hour ago, she had been dusting shelves in a familiar routine, thinking of nothing beyond the small tasks of her evening. Now she stood at the edge of a mystery that reached back decades, tangled with a family far more powerful and far more dangerous than she had ever allowed herself to think about too closely. "Sir," she said quietly, "if what you suspect is true, what does that make me to your family?" Vittorio studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "That," he said, "is exactly what I intend to find out." He walked to his desk and picked up the telephone, his fingers moving with the practiced calm of a man used to setting large and complicated plans into motion. Before dialing, he paused and looked back at Elena one final time. "You will not clean tonight," he said. "Rest. Tomorrow, everything may look very different." Elena nodded slowly, though rest felt impossible with her mind racing the way it was. She excused herself and walked out of the study, down the long marble hallway toward the servants' quarters, her thoughts spinning with questions she had never dared to ask before tonight. Behind her, she heard Vittorio's voice, low and urgent, speaking into the telephone to someone whose name she did not catch. She caught only a few words before she turned the corner. Villa Rosa, Records, Isabella. Elena reached her small room and closed the door behind her, leaning against it as her legs finally gave in to the exhaustion of the last hour. She thought of her grandmother, sitting by that window every evening, watching the road, waiting for someone who never came. For the first time in her life, Elena wondered if her grandmother had been waiting for a chance to return to a family she had lost. And for the first time, Elena understood that same family might now be searching for her. Outside her window, the estate lights glowed against the darkness, and somewhere in the house behind her, Vittorio Moretti was already setting into motion an investigation that would unravel decades of carefully buried secrets. Secrets that would soon reach directly into the small, quiet life Elena had built for herself, whether she was ready for it or not. She did not sleep that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every fragment of memory she had of her grandmother, searching for clues she had never known to look for. A half-remembered story here, a strange silence there, a photograph her grandmother once kept hidden in a drawer and never explained. By the time morning light crept through her window, Elena had made a decision. Whatever truth waited on the other side of this mystery, she would not run from it. She had spent her whole life in the shadow of unanswered questions, passed down from a grandmother she had loved but never fully understood. Now, finally, there might be a chance to understand everything. She rose from her bed, dressed for the day, and walked toward the main house, unaware that behind its heavy doors, the results of Vittorio's late-night calls were already beginning to arrive, carrying with them the first real answers to a mystery that had haunted two families for nearly half a century. By 7 in the morning, 3 men Elena had never seen before were already seated around the long table in Vittorio's private office. She learned later that one of them was Nathaniel Hall, a quiet researcher who had spent years tracing old family records across Italy for wealthy clients who wanted their pasts either confirmed or buried. Another was Charles Whitfield, the family's longtime lawyer, a careful man who rarely spoke unless he had something certain to say. The third was simply introduced as Edward, a man with sharp eyes who seemed to know how to find information that most people believed no longer existed. Vittorio had not slept either. His shirt was slightly rumpled, his eyes tired but alert, and stacks of old papers already covered his desk. When Elena entered with a tray of coffee, out of habit more than instruction, he waved her toward a chair instead of dismissing her. "Sit," he said. "You are part of this now, whether either of us expected it." Elena sat down carefully at the edge of the table, feeling strangely out of place among men who spoke in careful, measured tones about records, dates, and names she barely recognized. Nathaniel opened a thin folder and slid it toward Vittorio. "We found something," he said. "It took most of the night, but the old church registry in the village near Villa Rosa still holds baptismal records going back over 100 years. Your mother, Carlotta Moretti, was baptized there in 1952, and just as you suspected, there is a second entry only 2 years earlier, for a girl named Rosalia. Vittorio's hand tightened around the edge of the folder. Rosalia, he repeated quietly. That was the name in the photograph. I always suspected it, but no one would ever confirm it for me. There is more, Nathaniel continued. The registry lists both girls as daughters of Antonio Bellini and his wife, your grandfather, sir, which means Rosalia was not a distant cousin or a family friend, as some old rumors suggested. She was your mother's full sister. Elena listened quietly, feeling a strange tightness building in her chest. She thought of her grandmother's quiet sadness, the way she used to stare out the window in the evenings, and wondered now if that sadness had a name after all. What happened to her? Vittorio asked. Why was she erased so completely from our family's memory? Charles Whitfield finally spoke, his voice calm and careful, the voice of a man used to delivering difficult truths without letting emotion interfere. That is the harder part to answer, he said. Official records simply stop. There is no marriage certificate for Rosalia Bellini. No death certificate either, at least not under that name. It is as though she vanished from all documentation entirely after the year 1971. 1971, Vittorio murmured. That would have been shortly before my mother married my father and moved away from Villa Rosa herself. Edward, the sharp-eyed man who had said little until now, leaned forward. We did find one more thing, he said. A shipping record. A woman named Isabella Conti boarded a passenger vessel from Palermo in the autumn of 1971, traveling alone, listed simply as a domestic worker seeking employment abroad. The record lists her age as 21. If Rosalia Bellini was born in 1950, as the baptismal registry states, she would have been exactly that age at the time this Isabella Conti made her journey. The room went completely silent. Elena felt her pulse quicken, the pieces beginning to align in a way she both wanted and dreaded to understand. Are you saying, Elena said slowly, breaking the silence for the first time, that my grandmother, Isabella Conti, and this missing sister, Rosalia Bellini, might be the very same woman? It is possible, Nathaniel said carefully. We cannot say for certain without further evidence, but the timing, the age, the region, all of it lines up in a way that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Vittorio rubbed his temples slowly, clearly overwhelmed by the weight of what he was hearing. If this is true, he said, then my mother's sister did not simply disappear. She changed her name and fled the country entirely. Something must have happened that was serious enough to make her abandon her identity completely and start a new life under a different name in a different land. What could cause someone to do that? Elena asked quietly. To leave behind everything, even her own name? Charles Whitfield exchanged a brief glance with Vittorio before answering carefully. In families like yours, sir, there are many reasons a person might choose to disappear. A broken engagement arranged without her consent, a disagreement over inheritance, a betrayal too painful to face directly, sometimes even a disagreement between sisters that turned bitter enough to end in permanent separation. Vittorio's jaw tightened. My mother never remarried after my father passed, and she rarely spoke of her own father, my grandfather, except with a kind of quiet resentment she never fully explained. Perhaps whatever happened between the sisters involved him as well. Elena sat quietly, absorbing all of this new information, trying to reconcile it with the gentle, private woman she had known as her grandmother. The idea that Isabella Conti had once been Rosalia Bellini, a young woman fleeing a powerful and dangerous family, felt both impossible and, somehow, entirely fitting with the quiet sorrow Elena remembered so well. There is one more avenue we can pursue, Nathaniel said, pulling out another paper from his folder. If Isabella Conti truly was Rosalia Bellini, there may still be people alive today who remember her from before she left. An old employer, perhaps, or a household staff member from Villa Rosa, who would have known her personally. If we can find such a person, they may be able to confirm her identity beyond any doubt. Do such people still exist? Vittorio asked. There is one name in the old estate records, Nathaniel said. A woman named Margaret Ellery, an English governess who worked at Villa Rosa during those years. hired to teach the family's children foreign languages. According to the records, she left Italy not long after Rosalia disappeared and returned to England. If she is still alive, she would be quite elderly now, but she may remember details no written record could ever capture. Vittorio straightened in his chair, a new resolve settling over his tired features. "Find her," he said. "Wherever she is, however difficult it may be, I want her found." Over the following days, the investigation expanded quickly. Nathaniel and Edward worked tirelessly, tracing old employment records, contacting distant relatives of the Bellini family, who had scattered across Italy and abroad, and slowly piecing together a portrait of a family fractured by secrets that had never been fully explained even to those who lived through them. Elena, meanwhile, found herself in an unusual position. No longer simply a housekeeper going about her quiet daily routine, she was now regularly summoned to Vittorio's study to answer questions about her grandmother, to search through old boxes of family belongings she had kept in storage since her grandmother's passing, and to share every fragment of memory she could recall, however small or seemingly unimportant. One afternoon, while searching through an old chest in her mother's attic, Elena found something she had forgotten existed. A small tin box, tucked beneath a stack of folded linens, containing a handful of yellowed photographs, and a single faded letter, written in careful, old-fashioned handwriting. She brought the box immediately to Vittorio's study, her hands trembling slightly as she set it down on his desk. Vittorio opened the tin box carefully, lifting out the photographs one at a time. The first showed a young woman standing in front of a grand villa, her dark hair pulled back, her expression guarded, but unmistakably familiar. Vittorio's breath caught as he studied the image. "This is her," he said quietly. "This is the same woman from the photograph I found in my grandfather's desk all those years ago. Older here, perhaps by a year or two, but it is unmistakably the same face." Elena leaned forward, studying the photograph herself, searching for any resemblance to the grandmother she remembered. The eyes, she realized slowly, were exactly the same, carrying that same quiet sadness Elena had noticed so many times, without ever understanding its source. Vittorio then unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning quickly over the faded ink. His expression shifted from curiosity to something heavier, something closer to grief. "What does it say?" Elena asked softly. Vittorio read aloud, his voice unsteady. "My dearest sister, I do not know if this letter will ever reach you, or if you will even wish to read it if it does. I have left Villa Rosa, and I do not intend to return. What happened between us, and what our father chose to do, has broken something in me that I do not believe can ever be repaired. I do not blame you for what happened. I blame only the silence that surrounded us both, and the choices made by those who should have protected us instead of dividing us. I will build a new life far from here, under a new name, and I ask only that you remember me kindly, even if the rest of the family chooses to forget I ever existed." The letter was unsigned, but the handwriting matched perfectly with notes Elena remembered seeing in her grandmother's old recipe books and garden journals throughout her childhood. Vittorio set the letter down slowly, his hands trembling now in a way Elena had never seen from a man so composed and controlled in every other aspect of his life. "She wrote this to my mother," he said, "and my mother never told me it existed. She let me grow up believing her sister had simply vanished without explanation, when all along there was a letter like this, carrying real answers, hidden away and never shared." "Perhaps your mother could not bear to share it," Elena offered gently. "Grief affects people in ways that are difficult to understand from the outside." Vittorio nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. "Perhaps. But it also means there is more to this story than even this letter reveals. What happened between them, what their father did. These are questions this letter raises, but does not answer." He looked up at Elena, his eyes searching hers with a new intensity. "We must find Margaret Ellery," he said. "If anyone alive today knows the full truth of what happened at Villa Rosa in 1971, it will be her." Within a week, Nathaniel located a possible match for Margaret Ellery, now in her late 80s, living quietly in a small coastal town in the south of England. Vittorio wasted no time arranging travel, and within days, he and Elena found themselves boarding a private flight together, an arrangement that felt almost surreal to Elena, given how recently she had been nothing more than an anonymous housekeeper in his household. During the flight, Vittorio remained largely silent, staring out the window at the clouds below, lost in thoughts Elena could only guess at. Finally, as the plane began its descent, he turned to her with an expression she had not seen from him before, something almost vulnerable. "I have spent my entire life building strength around myself," he said quietly, "protecting my family, expanding what my grandfather and father built before me, making certain no one could ever see weakness in me. But this, Elena, this uncovering of an old and hidden sorrow, has shaken something in me I did not know still existed." Elena did not know how to respond to such honesty from a man she had once feared and rarely spoken to beyond simple pleasantries. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "some truths are worth the discomfort of finding them, even after so many years." Vittorio studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly, as though her words had settled something within him that had been unsettled for a very long time. As the plane touched down, and they prepared to meet the one woman who might finally confirm everything they had uncovered, both Elena and Vittorio understood that whatever Margaret Ellery revealed to them would change everything they thought they knew about their intertwined families and about themselves. The small coastal town was quiet, with narrow streets and cottages that looked out over gray water. Margaret Ellery lived alone, in a modest stone house near the edge of the town, cared for occasionally by a neighbor who checked in on her. When Vittorio and Elena arrived at her door, an elderly woman with silver hair and sharp, alert eyes greeted them with a mixture of surprise and quiet recognition, as though she had somehow been expecting a visit like this for many years. "Moretti," she said softly, studying Vittorio's face carefully. "You have your grandfather's eyes. I wondered if someone from that family would come looking eventually." She invited them inside, and over a pot of tea that neither of them touched, Margaret Ellery finally began to speak about the years she had spent at Villa Rosa, decades ago, teaching the Bellini children. "I taught both girls," she said, "Carlotta and Rosalia. Carlotta was obedient, careful, always trying to please her father. Rosalia was different. She questioned things. She had a mind of her own, and in a household like that, such independence was rarely welcomed." "What happened between them?" Vittorio asked gently. "Between my mother and her sister?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "It was not truly between the sisters," she finally said. "Not at first. It began with your grandfather, Antonio. He had arranged a marriage for Rosalia, to a man from a powerful business family, a match meant to strengthen the Bellini family's standing. But Rosalia had fallen in love with someone else entirely, a young man who worked as a groundskeeper on the estate, a man far beneath the family's expectations." Elena felt her breath catch, understanding immediately the shape of the tragedy beginning to unfold. "Antonio discovered the relationship," Margaret continued, "and he was furious. He dismissed the young man from his position and forbade Rosalia from ever seeing him again. But Rosalia refused to accept the arranged marriage. She confronted her father directly, something no one in that household ever dared to do. And she told him she would rather leave the family entirely than marry a man she did not love." "And my mother?" Vittorio asked. "Where did she stand in all of this?" Margaret's expression grew troubled. Carlotta was frightened of her father's anger, and she believed, perhaps wrongly, that supporting her sister's rebellion would bring shame and ruin upon the entire family. When Antonio demanded that Carlotta reveal where Rosalia had been meeting this young man in secret, Carlotta, out of fear more than malice, told him everything she knew. Vittorio's face went pale. She betrayed her own sister. "She did not see it as betrayal at the time," Margaret said gently. "She saw it as obedience, as loyalty to the family she believed she was protecting. But the consequences were severe. Antonio had the young groundskeeper sent away from the region entirely, with strict instructions that he never return. Rosalia was devastated, believing at first that he had simply abandoned her without explanation, not realizing for weeks that her own sister's words had caused his removal." Elena's throat tightened as she listened, thinking of her grandmother's quiet sadness, the way she used to watch the road every evening, as though waiting for someone who would never come walking up it again. "When Rosalia finally learned the truth," Margaret continued, "that it was Carlotta who had revealed her secret to their father, Something between the sisters broke that could never be repaired. Rosalia felt she could no longer trust anyone in that house, not her father, and certainly not her sister. Within a matter of weeks, she gathered what little money she had saved, and she disappeared entirely, leaving no note, no explanation beyond what little she may have written to Carlotta privately before she left. There was a letter, Vittorio said quietly, glancing at Elena. We found it among Elena's grandmother's belongings. Rosalia wrote to Carlotta before she left, telling her she did not entirely blame her, but that she could no longer remain in a household built on silence and control. Margaret nodded slowly. That sounds like Rosalia. She was proud, but she was not cruel. I imagine leaving that letter was her way of finding some peace, before starting a new life far away from everything she had known. Do you know what became of the young groundskeeper? Elena asked softly. The man she loved? Margaret's eyes grew distant, as though reaching back through decades of memory. I heard many years later, second-hand through old estate contacts, that he eventually settled abroad as well, that he never married, and that he spent the remainder of his life working quietly as a gardener on various private estates. Whether he and Rosalia ever found each other again, I cannot say. I lost contact with the family myself not long after Rosalia's disappearance. Antonio dismissed most of the household staff who had witnessed the affair too closely, myself included, fearing that we knew too much, and might speak of it in ways that could embarrass the family. Vittorio sat back in his chair, absorbing the full weight of everything Margaret had revealed. For decades, he had believed his mother's silence about her sister stemmed simply from grief over a mysterious disappearance. Now he understood that the silence had been rooted in something far more complicated: guilt, shame, and a decision made out of fear that had cost Carlotta her sister forever. My mother carried that guilt her entire life, he said quietly. I remember now, moments when she seemed to drift far away in thought, moments of sadness she never explained. I always assumed it was simply grief over losing her sister to whatever mysterious fate had befallen her. I never imagined she believed herself responsible for that loss. Guilt like that does not fade easily, Margaret said gently. I imagine your mother spent her whole life wishing she could take back those words she spoke to her father, wishing she had found the courage to protect her sister instead of exposing her secret out of fear. Elena, who had remained mostly quiet throughout this painful revelation, finally spoke. My grandmother never once spoke ill of her sister. Not that I ever heard. She spoke of her family with sadness, yes, but never with anger. Perhaps, despite everything, she understood why Carlotta did what she did, even if she could not fully forgive it. Margaret smiled faintly, a tired, knowing smile. That sounds like the Rosalia I remember. She had a fierce spirit, but a forgiving heart beneath it, even when the world around her gave her little reason to extend that forgiveness. The conversation continued for another hour, Margaret sharing smaller details and memories, stories of the sisters as young girls, before the fracture that would eventually separate them forever, stories of Villa Rosa, in quieter, happier times, before ambition and fear took hold of the family that lived there. As the afternoon light began to fade, Vittorio finally rose from his chair, his expression heavy with the weight of everything he had learned. Thank you, he said sincerely, taking Margaret's frail hand gently in his own. You have given me answers I have searched for my entire life, even when I did not fully understand the questions I was asking. I am glad I lived long enough to share them, Margaret replied. Some truths deserve to outlive the silence that once surrounded them. Before they left, Margaret reached into an old wooden box on a nearby shelf and withdrew a small, faded photograph, handing it carefully to Vittorio. It showed two young girls, arms linked together, laughing in front of the grand entrance of Villa Rosa, their faces bright with a joy that seemed impossibly distant from everything that would eventually come between them. Keep this, Margaret said softly. I have held on to it far longer than I probably should have. It belongs with the family now, whatever remains of it, more than it belongs with an old woman who simply happened to witness a piece of their history. Vittorio accepted the photograph with visible emotion, studying the faces of two sisters who had once been inseparable before circumstances tore them apart forever. As they said their goodbyes and made their way back toward the waiting car, Elena walked quietly beside Vittorio, both of them lost in their own thoughts, processing everything they had just learned. The mystery that had begun with a simple, half-remembered lullaby had unraveled into a story of love, fear, betrayal, and lifelong regret. A story that connected their two families in ways neither of them could have imagined only weeks earlier. "What happens now?" Elena finally asked, as the car pulled away from the quiet coastal town. Vittorio looked down at the old photograph in his hands, tracing his finger gently over the faded image of the two young sisters. "Now," he said quietly, "I must decide what to do with the truth we have finally uncovered, and what it means for both of our families moving forward." Elena said nothing, but she felt, for the first time since this journey began, a strange sense of peace settling over the questions that had haunted her grandmother's memory for so many years. Whatever difficult truths remained ahead, at least now, both of their families finally understood the real story behind the silence that had shaped so much of their lives. Back at the estate, the atmosphere had shifted in ways Elena had not anticipated. Word had begun to spread quietly among the household staff and the wider family circle that Vittorio had traveled abroad with the housekeeper, and that something significant had been discovered about her past. By the time they returned, whispers followed Elena through the hallways, curious glances trailing her wherever she went. The most difficult reaction came from Vittorio's younger cousin, Gregory Ashcombe, a sharp, ambitious man who had long assumed he stood next in line to inherit significant responsibility within the family's affairs, given how few direct heirs Vittorio had. When word reached him that Elena might share blood ties to the family through a long-lost sister of Vittorio's own mother, Gregory wasted no time expressing his concerns. "This is madness," Gregory said, pacing across Vittorio's study, while Elena stood quietly near the door, having been summoned to join the conversation. "You bring a housekeeper into this house for years, and now, based on nothing more than an old song and the word of an elderly stranger in England, you intend to treat her as family. Do you understand what this could mean for how others perceive our family's stability?" "I understand perfectly well what it means," Vittorio said calmly, though there was a hard edge beneath his composed tone. "It means acknowledging a truth that my mother spent her entire life hiding out of guilt and fear. It means correcting a wrong that should never have happened in the first place." "And what if it is not entirely true?" Gregory pressed. "A song and a photograph are not proof of blood. Perhaps this woman has simply told you what you wanted to hear, whether intentionally or not." Elena felt her face grow warm with a mixture of embarrassment and quiet anger. "I have asked for nothing," she said firmly, surprising even herself with the steadiness of her voice. "I did not come to this house seeking a connection to your family. I have worked honestly here for 6 years, asking only for fair wages and quiet respect. If anything, this discovery has brought me more uncertainty than comfort." Gregory studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before turning back to Vittorio. "Regardless of her intentions, you must consider how this looks to the rest of the family, to our associates, to everyone who depends on stability within this household. A sudden, unproven claim of hidden family ties could create complications none of us are prepared to manage." Vittorio's expression grew stern. "I did not ask for your approval, Gregory. I asked for your patience, while the full truth is uncovered. If Elena's grandmother truly was my mother's sister, then Elena carries our blood, regardless of how inconvenient that truth may be for anyone's ambitions." Gregory's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further, offering only a curt nod before leaving the room, his footsteps sharp and deliberate against the marble floor. Once he was gone, Vittorio turned to Elena, his expression softening slightly. "I apologize for his behavior," he said. "Gregory has always been protective of his position within this family, sometimes more than is warranted." "He is not entirely wrong to be cautious," Elena admitted. "This is a great deal to accept, even for me. I have spent my whole life believing my grandmother was simply an ordinary woman with an ordinary, if quiet, past. Learning that she may have been born into a family as powerful and complicated as yours is difficult to absorb." Vittorio nodded slowly, understanding the weight of what she was expressing. "Perhaps there is more we can learn," he said, "something that might settle any remaining doubt, for both our sakes." That evening, Elena returned once more to the small collection of her grandmother's belongings she had kept carefully stored over the years. Beneath the tin box of photographs and the faded letter, She discovered something she had overlooked before, a thin, leather-bound journal, its pages worn soft with age, tucked into the lining of an old suitcase that had belonged to her grandmother. Elena brought the journal directly to Vittorio's study, her hands trembling slightly as she handed it to him. Together, they sat by the fire and carefully turned through its fragile pages, reading entries written in her grandmother's careful, familiar handwriting. The early entries described a young woman's arrival in a new country, frightened and alone, carrying little more than a small bag of belongings and a heart full of grief. She wrote of finding work as a domestic servant in a modest household, of slowly building a quiet life for herself under her new name, and of the constant, aching fear that someone from her past might one day recognize her and drag her back into a world she had chosen to leave behind forever. Further along, the entries grew warmer, describing her meeting with a kind, hard-working man who would later become Elena's grandfather, a humble tailor with no knowledge of her hidden past, who loved her simply for who she presented herself to be. She wrote of the quiet joy of building a family with him, of raising Elena's mother in a home filled with warmth despite its modesty, and of slowly allowing herself to believe that perhaps happiness was still possible, even after everything she had lost. But scattered throughout the journal were also entries filled with longing, brief passages in which she wondered about the young groundskeeper she had once loved, wondering if he had ever forgiven her for the misunderstanding that separated them, wondering if he had found happiness elsewhere, and quietly hoping, against all reasonable expectation, that their paths might somehow cross again. One entry, dated many years later, caught both Elena and Vittorio's attention immediately. It read simply, "I received word today, through an old acquaintance, that my sister Carlotta has passed. I did not attend the service, for I could not bear the thought of standing among a family that has buried its truths as deeply as they buried the sorrow I once caused them, however unintentionally. I forgive her, wherever she now rests. I understood, in my later years, that fear can make even loving people cause harm they never intended. I only wish we had found a way to speak honestly with one another before it became too late." Vittorio closed the journal slowly, his eyes glistening with emotion he made no attempt to hide. "She knew," he said quietly. "She knew when my mother passed, and she chose not to come forward, even then." "Perhaps she felt it was no longer her place," Elena offered gently. "Perhaps she believed too much time had passed, too much pain had already been caused, for reopening old wounds to bring anything but further difficulty." Vittorio nodded slowly, understanding the quiet wisdom in that choice, even as it filled him with a deep and unexpected grief for two sisters who had spent decades apart, carrying love and regret they were never able to properly express to one another. "There is one more entry," Elena said softly, turning to the final page of the journal. The last entry, written not long before her grandmother's passing, read simply, "I have hummed our old childhood song to my granddaughter tonight, the same song our mother once sang to both of us. I do not know if she will ever understand its full meaning, or the family it once connected her to, however distantly, but I hope, in some small way, that carrying this melody forward keeps a piece of our shared history alive, even if the rest of the story remains buried with me." Elena felt tears rise unexpectedly in her own eyes as she finished reading the passage aloud. It was as though her grandmother had somehow known, even decades ago, that this very song might one day lead her granddaughter back to a family she herself had chosen to leave behind. "She wanted this connection preserved," Vittorio said quietly. "Even if she never intended for it to be discovered so directly, she wanted some piece of her true identity to survive, passed down through you, even without the full story attached to it." Elena wiped gently at her eyes, feeling an overwhelming mixture of grief and gratitude settle over her. "I only wish I could have known her true story while she was still alive to share it herself," she said. "I would have liked to understand her more fully, to have offered her whatever comfort I could, had I known the weight she carried silently for so many years." Vittorio reached out and gently placed his hand over Elena's, a small gesture of shared understanding between two people whose lives had been unexpectedly bound together by history neither of them had chosen. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "we can honor her memory now, by finally bringing her story into the light, rather than allowing it to remain buried any longer." Elena nodded slowly, feeling a quiet resolve settle within her. Whatever complications remained ahead, whatever resistance might come from Gregory or others within the family, she understood now that walking away from this truth was no longer something she was willing to do. "What happens next?" she asked quietly. Vittorio looked down at the worn journal in his hands, then back up at Elena, his expression steady and resolved, despite everything that remained uncertain. "Next," he said, "we ensure that the truth your grandmother carried in silence for so long finally receives the acknowledgement and respect it deserves, regardless of how uncomfortable that truth may be for anyone unwilling to accept it." Outside the study window, evening settled quietly over the estate grounds, the same grounds where, only days earlier, Elena had simply been an anonymous housekeeper going about her quiet routine. Now, holding the fragile remnants of her grandmother's hidden past, she understood that her life, and her place within this powerful and complicated family, would never again be quite so simple. Word of Vittorio's intentions spread quickly through the family's wider circle in the days that followed, and just as Gregory had warned, not everyone received the news with grace. A gathering was called at the estate, drawing distant relatives and close associates alike, many of whom had never met Elena and knew her only as a name attached to sudden, unsettling rumors. The room was tense as Vittorio stood before them, the old photograph of the two young sisters resting on the table beside him, along with the fragile journal that had revealed so much. Elena stood quietly at his side, her hands folded tightly in front of her, doing her best to remain composed despite the weight of so many unfamiliar eyes studying her closely. "I understand," Vittorio began, addressing the room with the calm authority that had guided this family for decades, "that what I am about to share may unsettle some of you. It unsettled me as well when I first began to uncover it, but I have never been a man who believes comfort should be chosen over truth, and the truth I have uncovered deserves to be spoken plainly, regardless of how it may reshape our understanding of this family's history." He proceeded to explain everything that had been discovered: the forgotten sister, the forbidden love, the fear that led to betrayal, and the decades of silence that followed. He spoke of Margaret Ellery's testimony, of the journal Elena had found, and of the undeniable connection between Elena's grandmother and his own mother's long-lost sister. Gregory, seated near the front of the gathering, listened with visible discomfort, his arms crossed tightly against his chest. When Vittorio finished speaking, Gregory rose to his feet, his expression hard. "Even if everything you say is true," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the room, "what do you intend to do with this information? Elevate a housekeeper into a position of family standing, based on the sins of a generation none of us were even alive to witness?" A murmur moved through the gathered relatives, some nodding in cautious agreement with Gregory's concerns, others watching Vittorio carefully to see how he would respond. Vittorio remained calm, though his eyes carried a quiet intensity that silenced the room quickly. "I do not intend to elevate anyone based on convenience or sentiment," he said. "I intend to correct a wrong that was allowed to persist for far too long. My mother lived her entire life burdened by guilt for a betrayal she never had the chance to repair. Elena's grandmother lived her life in quiet exile, carrying love and forgiveness she was never able to properly express to the family she once belonged to. I will not allow that same silence to continue simply because acknowledging the truth feels inconvenient to some of you." Gregory opened his mouth to respond, but Vittorio raised a hand, silencing him gently but firmly. "I am not asking any of you to treat Elena as though she has always held a position within this family's business affairs," Vittorio continued. "She has expressed no interest in such things, and I would not force such a role upon her regardless. What I am asking is simply this: that she be recognized honestly as the granddaughter of my mother's sister, and that she be welcomed, if she chooses to accept it, as family, in whatever quiet and genuine way that recognition takes shape." Elena, who had remained silent throughout the gathering, finally spoke, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "I did not come here seeking status or inheritance," she said, addressing the room directly for the first time. "I came here originally simply to earn an honest living. I only wish, now that this truth has come to light, to honor the memory of two sisters who lost each other far too soon, and who never had the chance to make peace with one another, while they still could. If that means simply being acknowledged honestly, rather than treated as a stranger within a story that is, in part, my own, then that is truly all I ask." A long silence followed her words, the weight of her sincerity settling over the room in a way that seemed to soften even some of the harder expressions among the gathered relatives. Gregory, though clearly still uneasy, said nothing further, eventually taking his seat once again without further protest. In the weeks that followed, the family slowly began to adjust to this new understanding of their shared history. Elena continued much of her quiet daily life, though she was no longer treated simply as household staff, but rather as a distant relative finding her footing within an unfamiliar and complicated world. Vittorio, for his part, found himself changed by the entire experience, softened in ways his closest associates had rarely witnessed before. One evening, several months after the gathering, Vittorio invited Elena to join him in the same study where their strange journey had first begun. A small fire crackled in the hearth, and the old photograph of the two young sisters now rested in a simple frame upon his desk, a permanent reminder of the truth they had uncovered together. "I have been thinking," Vittorio said, as Elena settled into the chair across from him, "about what it truly means to carry a family's legacy forward. For most of my life, I believed that legacy meant strength, control, and the careful protection of power built by those who came before me. But this experience has taught me something different." "What is that?" Elena asked gently. "That legacy also means honesty," Vittorio said. "It means acknowledging the mistakes of those who came before us, rather than allowing silence to protect us from facing them. My mother built a life around hiding her guilt, and in doing so, she lost the chance to ever truly make peace with her sister. I do not wish to repeat that same mistake within my own life." Elena smiled softly, thinking of her grandmother's quiet strength, and the sadness she had carried so gracefully for so many years. "I believe she would be glad to know her story is no longer hidden," Elena said. "Even if the truth came with its share of difficulty, at least now it exists honestly, rather than buried beneath decades of silence." Vittorio nodded, reaching over to gently pick up the small photograph from his desk, studying the joyful faces of the two young sisters captured in that single, fleeting moment, before life pulled them apart. "I would like to have a proper memorial created," he said, "for both of them, together. Something that honors their bond as sisters, rather than the years of separation that followed. Would you help me arrange it?" "I would be honored to," Elena said sincerely. In the months that followed, a small, quiet memorial garden was established at the edge of the estate grounds, planted with the same variety of roses that had once grown wild around Villa Rosa many decades earlier. A simple stone marker was placed at its center, engraved with both sisters' names, side by side, along with a single line taken directly from Rosalia's own hidden journal. "Love and forgiveness outlast even the longest silence." Elena found herself visiting the garden often in the quiet hours of the evening, sometimes humming softly the same gentle lullaby that had started this entire journey, feeling a quiet, comforting connection to a grandmother she now understood far more completely than she ever had before. Vittorio, too, found himself drawn to the garden in moments of reflection, standing quietly before the stone marker, finally at peace with a piece of his family's history that had haunted him silently for most of his life. As for Gregory and the others who had once expressed hesitation, time slowly softened their resistance as well, watching Elena carry herself with quiet dignity and genuine humility rather than any pursuit of status or advantage. In time, she became simply another respected member of an extended and complicated family, her presence a living reminder of the importance of honesty over silence and forgiveness over lingering resentment. Late one evening, many months after everything had finally settled, Vittorio found Elena in the garden once more, humming softly beside the stone marker, as the sun set gently behind the distant hills. "You still sing it," he said quietly, approaching from behind. "I always will," Elena replied with a gentle smile. "It is the one piece of her story I always carried with me, long before I understood its true meaning. Perhaps that is exactly what she intended all along." Vittorio smiled, a rare, genuine warmth spreading across his usually guarded features. "Perhaps," he said, "some truths find their way to the surface exactly when they are meant to, carried forward quietly through the simplest of things, waiting patiently until someone finally asks the right question. Together they stood in comfortable silence as the evening settled fully over the garden. Two people once separated by circumstance and status, now quietly bound together by a shared history finally brought into the light, carrying forward not the old family's silence, but its long overdue truth, and the enduring love between two sisters who had, at last, found their way back to one another, even if only through the memory carried gently in a single, simple song.